Dawn is not a color here. It is a noise. First the phone, then the boots, then the chalk dragging across the laminated plastic of a wall map that has been wiped too many times. The controller in the JG-26 ready room, eyes like thumbtacks, circles a formation that isn't a formation yet, just a blurry report from a picket station over the North Sea that says heavy engines. Many bearing 265. Condensation bracelets the windows. A clerk fumbles a pencil, and it rolls into a crack in the floorboards and disappears as if swallowed by the war. A siren tests its throat somewhere on the airfield, not yet raised to panic, only clearing itself. A pilot skids on wet linoleum and laughs too loud, the way people do when the morning is a cliff. Coffee steams. One of the radios is slightly off frequency, and the voices in its metal body sound like they are speaking from inside a bucket. The map is a mosaic of distances and assumptions. The controller's circles become ovals as his hand speeds up. He wants hard edges, but all he has is temperature inversions and radar ghosts. His problem, and Germany's, is written right there in his chalk. He is trying to draw airplanes. The enemy, just now crawling off assembly jigs across an ocean he cannot see, has been drawing ours. Staid airfield breathes under the weight of ritual. Mechanics pull prop covers and throw them like blankets on a bunk. A crew chief taps a fuel gauge with the confidence of someone who has learned to distrust needles. The squadron commander is older than everyone else by 10 years that he did not choose. He holds the day's first decision in his mouth like a coin. Wait for confirmation, save fuel, keep altitude as a weapon, or scramble now, push west fast, try to hit them early and break the stream before it coheres. He asks for fresh weather. What he gets is yesterday's weather with today's date hurriedly penciled on. Out past the hedges, a bicycle bell rings. Everything in this room is local, human, particular. A cracked mug handle, a nicked sextant case, a stopwatch with a spider crack that lines up with 8 minutes. Beyond the coastline, the enemy is statistical. The chalk ovals grow a tail. The controller scratches in a guess about altitudes, then crosses it out. Someone reads a fragment from a signal intercept and says it out loud as if that makes it truer. Multiple groups, likely American, possible fighter cover in depth. Depth is a cruel word today. The Luftwaffe once flew with the arrogance of altitude. Now the Americans arrive with the arrogance of schedule. The duty officer thinks of schedule as a weakness predictability that can be ambushed. He does not know yet that the schedule is the weapon. He does not know that across Michigan and California and Texas and Washington the day is not dawning. It is continuing, a night shift handing a day shift, a wrench that is still warm, a foreman checking tact time with a glance more precise than a clock. He does not know that somewhere a foreman is telling a boy he will never meet to move his wrist an inch to the left, so a rivet will sit clean on a spar, and a bomber 60 days from this moment will not shudder in cloud. The first takeoff slot is printed on a roster that assumes fuel that may or may not arrive. The controller glances again at the map's northern margin where the ink has been rubbed thin, a million fingerprints abrading reality into vagueness. A runner appears with a fresh plot, 2 more contacts, wider spaced. The room leans toward the paper as if it were heat. A corporal clears his throat to read out the ammunition allotment and stops halfway because it is what it always is. Enough, unless it isn't. Outside, the engineers of the airfield, who do not wear insignia of genius and would be insulted by it, have calculated how to coax a few more takeoffs from a tired strip by shifting the chalk line 10 meters, by sweeping a puddle to the other side of a crown in the asphalt, by telling a driver to idle his truck diagonal to the wind to block a cross-current. Strategy masquerades as housekeeping. The first pair wheels up, then the next, climbing into a morning that is clearing its throat the way morning always does in a northern latitude, a grey sound that becomes direction. In the radio there is the clipped calm of men who believe control is possible if syntax is precise. Angels 25. Angels 28. Angels 30. Contrails forming like pencil lines dragged across blue. The controller presses a palm to the map as if to keep the paper from wrinkling. He does not have enough information to be wrong in a useful way. Intelligence has become a lagging indicator, and lag is lethal when the other side's planning cycle is measured in conveyor belt sections rather than in staff work hours. He marks an arrow where he thinks the leading group will bend. He draws it as if it were a sentence finishing itself. He has no idea that in Kansas a train has already started to roll with crates that will become tail assemblies, that will become decisions he will be forced to make in 2 months. He knows, dimly, that production matters. He does not yet know that production is the front line. There is always a story in the ready room about the day they caught them turning, the day the stream opened like a zipper and they slipped in and did work. Today they will try again. A pilot zips a glove slowly, as if sealing a promise. The engines out there on the field warm into a chorus that is both music and arithmetic. In the corner, someone folds yesterday's newspaper to the crossword, an act of defiance against magnitude. They joke that the Americans are soft. They joke because the alternative is to admit that softness is a luxury of abundance, and abundance is a weapon if you know how to use boredom as ammunition. The chalk circles on the map widen again, and for a heartbeat the controller sees not circles but clock faces, each with its own second-hand racing, and for the first time this season he understands that what is coming at them is not a fixed number of aircraft but a rate. The phone rings with the special tone that means the sea radars have stopped guessing and started counting. The voice in the wire does not wait to be asked. Many. The controller says many back, a word that carries shame when you say it out loud because it means you have failed to know. Scramble is shouted now without irony. Fatigue stands and becomes speed. The chalk feels damp in his fist. He draws one more circle that is really a confession and underlines it twice because he needs to do something physical to fight an enemy that is conceptual. He looks up. He looks at the clock. He thinks of hours, and for the first time of the war, he hears them ticking toward him like engines. There is an impulse in war to deify the dramatic, to make altitude and courage, do all the work in the telling because drama feels earned. But step out of the cockpit for a moment and stand under a truss in an American factory. Any factory. The kind that smells like cutting oil and graphite, and look down a long yellow line where floor tape argues with gravity. The verdict announces itself not as a slogan but as an arrangement. America did not simply fly bombers, it printed them. That is not metaphor. A printing press is not a crowd of letters. It is an agreement about spacing and pressure and timing that becomes a volume by refusing to care about the individual page. By 1943 and into 1944, the United States treated airframes as type. Each jig was a punctuation mark. Each station was a line break. The sentence that rolled off the assembly line every piece-counted hour was not one airplane, then another, then another. It was a cadence. Call it the tyranny of takt. In Detroit and Fort Worth and Seattle, takt time, the measured beat of work that lets parts and people arrive when the work arrives, became doctrine. And doctrine, when it is good, is a form of mercy. Mercy because it frees the mind to solve the only problem that matters. Where do we put the next hour? The bomber per hour claim, debated in lounges and celebrated in posters, missed the deeper truth. When production settles into habit, habit becomes a strategy you can set your watch by. When America spoke about mass production, it was not boasting in the vulgar sense. It was reading out a schedule like a liturgy. 10 o'clock. Wings. 11. Harnesses. Noon. Lunch. 1. Test cell. 2. Rollout. 3. Snag list. 4. Fix. 5. Another hour achieved. The Luftwaffe, its finest tacticians, harvesters of seconds and angles, could not attack a habit. They could only shoot at its products. To say production was the weapon is to risk flattening the courage of crews and the brilliance of designers. But the courage and the brilliance were multiplied, which is the point. A bomber that never leaves the jig is a gesture. 1,000 bombers that leave on time a policy. The moral imagination of an assembly line is minimalist. Do the next small thing fast, then do it again slightly better. In this doctrine, complexity is tamed by repetition. Mistakes are exiled not because error is shameful, but because error slows the rhythm. Rhythm is oxygen. If the German pilot in the North German sky was master of energy management, speed versus altitude versus position, then the American foreman in a shirt with rolled sleeves was master of time management, seconds per rivet versus minutes per station versus hours per airframe. One managed motion, the other managed the creation of motion. In the end, the only motion that matters in a long war is replacement. That verdict shows up in quiet places. Look at a ledger where a purchasing clerk who has never seen a flak burst and does not wish to checks off the arrival of crates of fasteners in lots of 16,000 and rejects 3 crates because the threads are burred. Look at a payroll office where a woman with a hairpin behind one ear schedules an extra shift, not because patriotism demanded it, but because the anodizing unit will sit idle otherwise, and idle is treason against the schedule. Look into a tool room where a boy learns that a jig is a promise. If you present the work in the same way every time, the work will accept the tool in the same way every time, and repetition creates accuracy the way a river creates stone. This is not the language of heroism. It is the syntax of reliability. The enemy mistook the lack of poetry for a lack of force. The consequence is that numbers become sentences. Production is not simply a tally of B 24 seconds and B 17 seconds and later B 29 seconds. It is a grammar of sufficiency. The Americans, frankly provincial in their desire to count things, made counting a weapon by insisting that the unit of a count was not an airframe, it was an hour. A plant might roll out one every 60 or 90 minutes. A network of plants, with offsets and buffers and redundant tooling, could deliver a combined cadence that translated to 2 bombers every hour, sometimes more, sustained not by hype but by the physics of line balance. Tally them any way you like across the weeks when weather cleared, rail cars delivered, and foremen said no to perfection so they could say yes to departure times, and the edges of the claim sharpen rather than blur. The Luftwaffe intercepted the results. They never intercepted the schedule. To accept the verdict, step into the mental shift that American production demanded and rewarded. Adequate performance at unlimited quantity beats exquisite performance at exquisite scarcity. It is not that American machines were bad. They were good enough and, more importantly, the same. Standardization did to fear what altitude does to ground fire it, thinned it. Crews rotated through aircraft and found them boring in the best way. Parts moved in crates that looked like other crates, and fit into brackets that matched other brackets, and electrical looms plugged into sockets that had a number stamped into them that meant the same thing in Michigan as it did in Tulsa. Boredom is underrated in war. Boredom is the feeling that the system is holding. The verdict also has a human face, not the smiling poster face, but the expression you see in a cafeteria at 2:15 when a woman rubs her wrists and gets up again because the line must keep the beat, or the brief nod between a metallurgist and a welder when they decide to change a rod composition without waiting for permission because waiting would foul the takt, or the supervisor who learns to say fewer words and ask shorter questions because discourse is friction when the target is a rate. The Germans saw American abundance and called it wasteful. Sometimes it was. But in a rate war, the disciplined overproduction of spares and the casual scrapping of subassemblies that do not gauge green is not waste. It is a shield made of seconds. What does it mean for production to be the weapon? It means that the center of gravity moved from the brief heroic seizure of opportunity to the long unheroic domination of time. The Luftwaffe still had aces. The Americans built a system that made aces feel like rounding errors. The Luftwaffe still had moments. The Americans created an environment in which moments mattered less than hours achieved and replaced. All the glittering tactics in the world cannot reverse a graph line that points up and to the right, when that graph line is measured in departures per day and crews trained per week and fuel delivered per month. In that sense, the bomber stream overhead and the paint line curing back in Seattle are the same phenomenon seen at different scales, a commitment to the beat. The verdict, finally, is not triumphalist. It is cautionary. To make production the weapon, a democracy must submit to its own discipline. It must turn its rhetoric into staples and its ideals into tolerances. It must choose to be dull in a way that saves lives. The Germans did not misunderstand American courage. They misunderstood American monotony. They did not fear a single raid. They feared what they could not imagine: tomorrow's raid already underway, in a building they would never see, on a shift change they did not believe was possible, conducted by people who thought of themselves as ordinary and were, which is why they were invincible. Walk into Willow Run when it is fully awake, and your first thought is that someone built a city and laid it on its side. The roof ripples into distance as if the horizon had been hired as a foreman. The floor is a map with borders in yellow tape and streets of concrete. Everything here is a verb. The long final assembly line measured in fractions of a mile, because that is the only honest way to say long in this place, does not simply move. It translates understanding into motion. You can stand at one station and watch a wing rib arrive on a dolly that knows where it is going the way a migrating bird knows. Then watch a drill motor chatter into life, not because it is time to drill, but because the upstream takt says it is time to drill. When observers later said the factory was trying to build a bomber every hour, they were describing the symptom. The organism was trying to lock 1,000 separate tasks into one shared beat. That is why the place felt alive. Henry Ford's people did not invent the idea that an airplane could be built like a car. They did something subtler and more ruthless. They made a bomber behave like a car, in the one respect that matters most on a line. It agreed to be modular. That agreement did not live in the slogans or the posters of Willow Run. It lived in jigs that held parts in the same geometry every time, and in inspection routines that did not flatter, and in the willingness to redraw a station boundary with chalk at 3 a.m. because the handoff was dirty. There is a holiness in a clean handoff. The worker who tightens a pair of bolts with a calibrated wrist knows without thinking that the next worker will find them exactly as expected. Trust becomes throughput. That word throughput is sometimes accused of being cold, but here it is. Mercy, too, because every airframe that crosses the line clean is one less knot of delay for the cells where engines are tested and radios are installed and hydraulics are bled of their little pockets of failure. Willow Run was famous for its size because size photographs well. What does not photograph is the choreography that shrank distance into repeatable acts. Forklift drivers learned patterns that looked like folk dances if you watched from the catwalk. A cart would leave subassemblies and glide past a stack of crate lids, already staged for the next shift. The driver would nod to a rigger who would flick a palm to say, "Yes, the sling is rated, hang that now." The language of the line was not words. It was the velocity of glances. The foremen walked their rows, counting heartbeats, not because they were romantic, but because their bodies had been trained by months of pacing to know when a station had slipped by just enough seconds to matter. The factory practiced forgiveness too. Buffers stood like little dams, absorbing variation, releasing parts in equal measures. Rigid lines break, buffered lines learn. Stand at a jig where a fuselage section is held like a patient, and you will see something that looks like contradiction, a tolerance stack that only makes sense if you trust the future. The builders here accepted that some pieces would be scrapped, not with resignation but with a relief born of mastery. A rejected skin panel is a sacrifice to schedule. It is the admission that when you are feeding a beat, you must sometimes throw good work away to protect the time of the whole. That is the math of adulthood. Perfectionists hate this. Foremen love it. Pilots who never learn the names of the men and women who made their aircraft will owe their landing to it. In the air, you guard airspeed, even if it means crossing a few 100 meters wide of the perfect line. At Willow Run, you guard tact even if it means crossing a little wide of the perfect part. Visitors spoke in straight lines about miracles per hour. The people who labored here thought in circles. Circles on Andon boards that were filled in when a problem recurred. Circles on training rosters to track who had learned to use a new talk tool. Circles around the stations where the night shift taught the day shift. A trick that saved 20 seconds and lit the next day like a secret. The plant was porous to ideas. A janitor could watch a station and suggest moving a bin 3 feet and save 2 minutes across a week, and nobody laughed because 2 minutes is meat on a line that eats time. Management learned to love the unglamorous. Lighting improved not for morale, but so a gauge's needle didn't cast a shadow, which meant a measurement was read right the first time, which meant a defect never had to be discussed in meetings where nothing was ever built. There were days when the rhythm cracked. A rail line choked somewhere, a supplier stumbled, a blizzard put its hand over the region and pushed. The miracle is not that Willow Run never faltered. The miracle is how it recovered. Parallel lines meant sub-assemblies could be switched across. Redundancies let shortages find the path of least resistance and still become airplanes. The plant behaved like a network because, in truth, it was not one factory but a choreography of factories that agreed to meet inside one roof and put their names aside for the duration. You could walk from an area that smelled like cutting fluid to another that smelled like paint thinner and know, by the smells alone, where in the life of an airplane you were. That is how cities feel. That is how living things feel. In this place, the cliché that war is waste found its counter-argument. Waste is untransformed possibility. Willow Run specialized in transforming. People entered as novices and became apprentices, and then experts, and then teachers, without ever acquiring the vanity that sometimes attends expertise because the line punished vanity the way the sky punishes bravado. There was no room for heroes here in the cinematic sense. The heroes were the sequences that never broke. The sacred objects were not medals. They were checklists laminated against oil. The devotions were not speeches. They were tool changes that took seconds less each week until the saving compounded into airplanes. If some months the network added up to more than one bomber for each hour the sun and the clock conspired to create, that was less a miracle than a moral. Velocity begets velocity when you build a place where the speed of learning is a variable and not a coincidence. By the time a bomber rolled out into the Michigan light and blinked its landing lights at the world, like a newborn testing reflexes, the plant had already moved on. That is what outsiders get wrong about factories. The child leaves. The mother counts the next contraction. At Willow Run, the next contraction was already overdue, and the line leaned forward as a single animal to make up the seconds. You could hate the monotony if you were a poet, or you could see it for what it was, a promise made in concrete and steel and human shoulders that said, plain as a whistle at shift change, tomorrow is already on the way. Picture a map of the United States tilted slightly so the Pacific seems to spill into the Midwest, and the Gulf pushes up under Texas like a knee. Now draw 3 circles. Seattle, San Diego, Fort Worth, Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas. The circles are not proud, they are practical. Each one contains a vocabulary of parts: fuselage barrels, wing panels, tailplanes, nacelles, turrets, looms of wire that look like the nervous systems of extinct animals. The trick is not that each circle produces a complete sentence by itself. The trick is that the circles agree on grammar. Standardization approximates kindness across distance. A wing panel that leaves a jig in Seattle will not plead for interpretation in San Diego. A harness wired in Fort Worth will not need a translation dictionary when it meets a bulkhead drilled somewhere else. The triangle throughput was not just geography, it was etiquette. Start in Seattle, where the sky has moods and the people match it with a stubborn, patient competence. Here, aluminum is coaxed into shapes that obey, lift, and repay fatigue with loyalty. Ribs meet spars with a confidence learned from ships and modified for air. The waterfront humors the factories, feeding them with docks and rails that love weight. Move to San Diego, where the light is a little too clean and the ocean gives a factory a reason to think in horizons. Here, the skins are smoothed and the systems are married. Hydraulics taught to kneel and stand on command. Oxygen lines persuaded to be invisible and reliable at once. Then to Fort Worth, where the land seems to approve of scale. There is room to practice the art of simultaneous assembly, to split a problem into parallel lanes, and then make the lanes a chorus with parts metered, so deliveries and stations sing in the same key. The triangle is not an org chart, it is a circulatory system. Railroads make the triangle honest. Crates do not care about speeches. They care about arrival times. When a car wheel slips a flange on a mountain grade 2 states away, a planner who has never seen the mountain feels it as a pulse drop on a dispatch board and leans across a desk to call a man in another state and find a second-hand solution that is not second-rate. The triangle throughput survived because it was humble enough to be redundant. When the weather closed a pass, the network didn't write poetry about resilience. It sent subassemblies around the long way and made up the hours somewhere else by running a line a little longer and asking a foreman to keep the lights on and an inspector to check a few more gauge marks before she went home. The capacity to flex was not a flavor of the month, it was muscle. Inside each circle lived sub-circles, plants within plants. A turret line here, a propeller shop there, a harness cell 3 corridors down from the place where landing gear learned to kneel and stand. The temptation is to imagine magic. The reality is metrics. The triangle throughput existed in numbers that would bore anyone who wants war to be a fireworks show. Square footage allocated to kitting areas. Aisle widths that functioned as promises to forklift drivers that turning would not require apologies. Rejection rates that flowed not into shame, but into action lists, because a factory that nurses its ego will starve its schedule. The triangle was a wall of numbers that spoke softly. This many punch presses, this many drill heads, this many torque checks per wing route, this many radios staged for installation, this many looms per day per cell. If absenteeism stays under the threshold, the night shift supervisor swore she could hold. Against this arithmetic stood the enemy's attempt to make the war about singular excellence. Above 109 inches, the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime in the sky was a blade. A stream of B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds repeating a navigational doctrine learned at ground school and relearned at 15,000 feet in a cold that tried to make fingers doubt themselves was a saw. Blades win duels. Saws cut through structure. The triangle throughput cared about the structure of time. Somewhere in Seattle, a jig was eased a millimeter, and an hour was saved 3 weeks later in San Diego, when a panel fit without persuasion. Somewhere in Fort Worth, a clerk rebalanced. A kitting cart and a mechanic in a different state did not have to take 3 steps to fetch a fastener. The enemy could not strafe that millimeter. He could not bomb those 3 steps. He could only learn, too late, that an hour can be armored. The orchestration required humility that is hard to sell on posters. Designers accepted that a part that is easy to make poorly is a bad part even if it is brilliant on paper. Foremen accepted that a worker's hands are one of the most valuable gauges in the building, and that listening to them might make the rate happy. Inspectors accepted that catching defects is not an act of punishment, but an act of love for departure times. The triangle throughput required a social contract in which people trusted strangers in other states to do their job in the same way, and then proved that trust by building fixtures that made sameness the default. Doctrine hid in fixtures, philosophy hid in aisle markings, hope hid in rail schedules. When you step back and watch the triangle work, the psychological effect becomes visible. The enemy hears reports of factories and files them under propaganda because the numbers are offensive to a mind trained to think of industrial capacity as a swelling that will subside. But the triangle throughput never swelled. It settled. Settlement is scarier than surge. A surge is a wave to be ridden or ducked. A settlement is a new sea level. When Boeing and Consolidated and Douglas found their mutual beat, the downstream phenomena training cycles, spares pools, serviceability rates that rose instead of fell as usage increased, behaved like water seeking its own level. If 2 bombers per hour sounds like bragging, watch it instead as a composite of small local truths that are indifferent to romance. This many stations multiplied by this many shifts divided by this many minutes, with this rejection rate at this set of tolerances, yields this cadence across this network. It is not boast. It is algebra. Stand at the edge of the triangle and listen for a minute. It sounds like nothing in particular. The hiss of pneumatics, the groan of a rail car slowing into a yard, the click of a stamp, the scribble of a pencil in the hand of a woman who will erase her own checkmark if the part she just Measured is more beautiful than it is correct. But if you listen longer, if you let the noise stack, it becomes a drum. And once you hear the drum, you understand why men in northern skies on cold mornings looked up and saw not a formation but a rhythm. The triangles on their maps were wrong shapes for the war they were fighting. The right shape was a circle, repeated, and inside each circle a point that meant now, and then another point that meant now again, and then another, until the space between them vanished and time itself felt like a machine. Begin with a stopwatch and a ledger, not a myth. A bomber hour is not a poster on a breakroom wall or a boast in a radio address. It is the sum of rhythms that refuse to apologize for their arithmetic. Picture a line foreman tapping a wristwatch while a crate slides into place. A torque wrench barks twice, and a signal lamp blinks green. Multiply that blink by 1,000 stations. Multiply the 1,000 by 3 shifts. Then ask a rude question. How many seconds can be stolen from a single station without anyone dying later because a bolt backed out at altitude? The answer is not a slogan, it is a table. If you are honest, the table begins to look like a prayer. The mathematics starts before aluminum learns the shape of air. It starts in bauxite and electricity, in the Tennessee Valley where turbines write their own psalms in megawatt hours, because every bomber is also a report on the flow of electrons. Take 12 tons of aluminum per airframe as an order of magnitude center. Add steel in the landing gear and guns, copper in the wiring, rubber in the tires and seals, glass in the turrets, and a nation's appetite becomes a daily rate. For 2 bombers per hour across a distributed network, the feedstock must be disciplined. Railcars must enter yards on schedules tight enough to parody arrogance. Coal must arrive at the power plants that kiss ingots into billets. The billets must turn into sheet, extrusion, forgings, and those must travel in cradles so snug that vibration becomes a rumor rather than a fact. None of this is accidental. Rate teaches humility by punishing everything that wants to be special. A bomber hour can be decomposed into work elements, the way a physicist decomposes motion into vectors. Wing assembly consumes so many minutes per rib, per spar, per panel. Fuselage barrels are pinned and riveted under a doctrine that says repeatability is a form of kindness. Wiring looms are braided and tested in racks that look like the nervous system of an industrial animal. Each pass divided by fail light is a micro-verdict. Engines, those monarchs with appetites, sit in test cells devouring gasoline so that human beings will not have to at altitude. The waste heat warms the shop in winter. Efficiency and mercy shake hands. Somewhere, a woman in a lab coat drops a coupon of alloy into a bath to test corrosion. The clock starts when the coupon hits the liquid and stops when the liquid gives up its secret. She writes a number. The number is a small defiance against chaos, and added to the ledger it is a vessel of calm. You can time the line by footsteps. From the kitting area to the workstation, 37 paces if the aisle is clear, 42 if a cart noses out at the wrong angle, 56 if someone parked a ladder like a question mark. Audit that 10 times, and you have an average to offer the day shift as a present. Move the bin 3 feet, and we buy back 20 seconds. 20 seconds times 800 trips becomes 4.5 hours, which becomes the difference between a Friday rollout and a Saturday overtime shift, where men's hands are slower because their children had a school pageant, or their backs ache the way backs do when a republic asks them to be part of a machine. The mathematics is not cold, it is intimate. You can place your palm on it and feel it vibrate. On paper, it is beautiful. Let T be tucked time, the target heartbeat of the line. Let S be the number of stations, P the people per station, lambda the failure rate that becomes rework, and beta the buffer capacity that rescues the day from the arrogance of precision. Then cadence C across a network of lines is roughly the inverse of the sum of station times, discounted by the drag of lambda and rescued by beta. It sounds like algebra, and it is, but it tastes like coffee that has gone cold because you stayed to fix a problem instead of sipping. With good fixtures and decent luck and a staff who no longer sighs when someone says Kaizen because improvement has ceased to be a sermon and become a reflex, T settles. When T is calm, S can hold. When S holds, lambda doesn't terrify, and beta stops being a crutch and becomes a stride. Add multiple factories with different specialties and different weather and different local genius. Then let logistics lubricate the unions between them, and C creeps from one bomber every 90 minutes toward one every 60, then toward a network rate that flirts with 2 per hour when the winds favor ships and trains, and the influenza bug spares the night shift. Not all minutes are equal. The line knows that a minute stolen from an upstream cell cascades into downstream starvation. That is why planners develop a superstition that is not superstition at all. Protect the gate. Engine deliveries, wing assemblies, the long lead harnesses, these are gates. Any child knows that the most important note in a song is the one that tells you when the next note will come. In factories, gates play that note. A gate does not need to be glamorous. It needs to be on time. When the gate is on time, small failures elsewhere do not become stories. They become footnotes. When the gate is late, every other station becomes a storyteller with a grievance. In war, grievance is wasted oxygen. The mathematics of the hour is the mathematics of keeping promises. Consider inspection. A naive mind thinks inspection subtracts from speed. The line knows better. A defect buried is a theft of future hours. Better to arrest it at the station, to convert later catastrophe into now irritation. That conversion has a rate too. Gauge checks per part, sampling plans per shift, first, article verifications per serial number. If a fixture is a physical sermon on sameness, inspection is a civic right that says sameness matters because we choose to care for strangers we will never meet. Somewhere an inspector circles a dimension on a form with a red pencil and signs a name that is not the one on a poster. That signature is a ration card for the schedule. It buys back an hour that would have been lost over the North Sea. Fuel is mathematics made liquid. A bomber hour implies a river of 100 over 130, flowing toward wings that will turn it into lift, toward engines that will break it into explosions, gentle enough to feel like music. The refinery yields gallons per day. The pipeline offers barrels per hour. The tanker cars count in wheels on rails that harvest friction like a tax. The arithmetic walks from chemistry to weather, to paperwork, to the gloved hand that opens a valve. It arrives at one proposition. If we do not make the fuel rate, the airframe rate will hurt to look at. Therefore, the plant that builds the empty bomber and the plant that distills the stuff that convinces the bomber to behave are partners in an equation. Call it fellowship if you like. The mathematics does not mind a good word. Finally, convert the results into human time. If a network settles into 2 bombers every hour during a fortnight of clear weather and steady freight, that is 48 aircraft in a day, 336 in a week. Some will be held for snags, some will wait for a part. But most will move onward like polite soldiers who do not push but do not yield either. They will feed training units and combat groups and replacement pools. They will give commanders permission to plan instead of plead. They will write a quiet letter to the enemy saying, "We are not counting airplanes, we are counting hours achieved." There is no reply to such a letter that a tactic can draft. There is only a strange silence on a northern field at dawn, where a controller draws circles on a map and does not yet know he is looking at algebra with contrails. At first glance, a scrap bin looks like defeat, a panel that will never meet a fuselage, a harness that will never hum with current, a gear that will never kneel to kiss a runway. Waste is the word outsiders choose because waste is the only word they have for things not used. But quality at scale teaches a different vocabulary. Rejection is not failure. Rejection is choreography. It is the decision to protect the rate by paying in metal rather than in hours, to spend a thing so that time can be saved. In a long war of replacement, time is the coin that buys survival. To mint that coin, you accept the theology of discard. Walk the quality lab. On one bench, a surface plate holds apart as if it were a map. An indicator nose drifts over it with a tenderness that verges on love. The gauge reads tenths of a thousandth because tight fits keep looseness where it belongs in the air, under judgment, not in the joint. On another bench, salt spray curls into a clear box where coupons, small pieces of alloy tagged like evidence, endure an accelerated future in which brine does its unkind work. A technician notes the first blush of oxides with a pinprick of satisfaction, because catching failure young is like catching a lie in the throat. The harm shrinks. Across the aisle, a fatigue rig flexes a spar until it feels like a metronome. It does not break. It confesses. Engineers read the confession and lengthen a doubler, change a radius, or tighten a heat treat recipe by a few degrees and a few minutes, a small edit that will be invisible in the air and decisive in history. Out on the line, inspection is not a priesthood that arrives after work is done to deliver sacraments and scoldings. It is braided into the work like a second pair of hands. First article checks on a new batch of parts are a handshake between supplier and station. We agree on what good looks like. Go divided by no-go gauges, democratize precision by letting a worker decide without begging for permission from a distant office. The gauge either accepts the truth of the part or it refuses, and pride has no vote. When the gauge refuses, the part does not wander. It walks straight to quarantine, where red tags bloom like a controlled fire in a field, burning away what could have become a conflagration later. If this feels heartless, consider the alternative. Defects that survive inspection become little terrorists embedded in systems far from their origin, exploding in places where the schedule is most vulnerable. Rejection is counter-terrorism with a torque wrench. The discipline that makes rejection a feature is cultural. Workers must be paid not only in wages but in respect to halt the line when a pattern smells wrong. You teach smell. Smell is not poetry. It is pattern recognition taught by older hands, who remember what trouble looks like when it is fleeing the scene. A senior riveter can hear a miss set by the timbre of the gun's exhale. A harness tech can see a loom that wants to chafe 3 months from now because the tie wrap sits where a vibration node will live. This is the expensive education of a republic. It pays not in diplomas but in fewer funerals. The paradox is that scale makes quality easier, not harder, when you design the line to love sameness. In a handcraft shop, variation is a signature. In a war factory, variation is a vandal. When fixtures present the work to the worker in the same pose every time, when tools index into locating pins that cannot lie, when checklists are written like poems, clear, brief, rhythmic skill is multiplied because the system greets it with a smile instead of a frown. That is why the night shift can match the day shift, and why a new hire's hands can produce acceptable work a week into the job. The line has been made a teacher that never sleeps. The best quality manager in the building is the station itself. Scrap rates should frighten accountants until they remember that the unit of account in a replacement war is not dollars but hours. A policy that says, scrap unapologetically when gauge says no, buys down downstream risk like an insurance premium. The premium is paid in bins of regret that nobody visits on family day. The payout is the absence of rework storms after rollout, the quiet delivery of aircraft to squadrons on dates that were spoken aloud weeks before without fingers crossed. The mind that learned to tally money as the highest truth resists this. But every bomber that lifts into grey weather with systems that behave like loyal dogs is a sermon delivered to skepticism. We chose the right currency. There is one more humility. Quality at scale refuses to fall in love with its own procedures. The lab that measured to tenths last month may learn to measure to whole thousandths next month because a process stabilized and the tighter measure adds no value. A visual inspection step may vanish because a sensor upstream began to whisper a better prophecy. Checklists shorten as confidence rises. Checklists lengthen when reality slaps confidence across the face. Nothing is sacred except the willingness to change. The paradox deepens. Constancy of output is protected by flexibility of method. A good inspector loves 2 things in equal measure, tradition and erasure. The last defense of quality is storytelling. Not the poster with the eagle, but the tale told on a bench at 02:10 about the time a bad batch of rivets sneaked onto the line, and how an apprentice noticed a different sheen under a cruel light and asked a question, and 100 panels were pulled and the schedule shrugged and caught up 2 days. Later, because buffers exist precisely for such acts of bravery. Stories convert rules into reflex. Rules become brittle under pressure. Reflex bends and survives. When a nation persuades tens of thousands of ordinary citizens to make extraordinary sameness, that nation is not merely manufacturing objects, it is manufacturing trust. In that trust, rejection is a feature because nobody has to pretend. The gauge says no, we say thank you, we move on, faster for having paused. The airplane is an honest animal. It obeys physics without a mood. People are weather. They arrive with hopes, leave with opinions, and in between they learn or they do not. If production is the weapon, then crew training is the ammunition feed. The people pipeline is the least photogenic miracle of the war because it looks like school. But a republic that builds airplanes every hour has to learn to build airmen and ground crews at a rate that rhymes, or else the hangars fill with beautiful, useless machines that gather dust and doubt. The trick is to standardize without becoming stupid, to create doctrine that teaches thinking rather than obedience. Begin with syllabi. A good syllabus is a map and a promise. It states what a human will be able to do, by when, at what standard, under what conditions, with what equipment. For pilots, that meant hours in primary trainers, then in advanced, then in the very kind of bird they would fly in anger, with instruments that would argue with their inner ears until the ear surrendered. For navigators, it meant the marriage of dead reckoning and radio ranges, and later beacons, and the art of telling a crew calmly that the world below is wrong, and the math is right. For bombardiers, it meant the slow creation of a relationship with a device that performed trigonometry while the sky tried to interrupt. For gunners, it meant a religion of lead and lag, and the humility to accept that the enemy also practiced a religion and would make the sky personal. Ground crews learned a different literacy. The sounds an engine makes before it complains out loud. The way a hydraulic line confesses a pinhole wound by sweating in places it should not. The torque values that feel like a handshake with a friend you trust. Doctrine, in this context, is love letter and threat. If you master this, we will trust you with the lives of strangers. If you do not, we will not. Production demands flow. People flow only when you make their learning modular. A training command that breaks tasks into blocks can move humans through cells the way a factory moves parts, with the difference that humans argue back. The argument is useful. When a class bogs down on a concept, the syllabus edits itself at speed, the way a line rearranges a station when a new fixture proves clumsy. Instructors meet in rooms that smell like chalk and coffee and rewrite a lesson for clarity and speed and mnemonic grace. The metric is not grades, it is serviceability of competence under stress. A man who can compute a wind-corrected track at a desk is charming. A man who can do it with frost on his eyelashes is the product we need. If the pipeline is to match the line, attrition must be planned, not suffered. Washout is not shame, it is sorting. The nation has other uses for hands that cannot learn to land in crosswinds. The duty of a system that respects citizens is to reassign with dignity and speed. A trainee leaves one path and enters another without falling through the floor. This is logistics of hope. The same thinking governs crew rotation. A group in theatre loses a bombardier. The replacement pool knows, not through rumour but through a file, which trained soul can be flown out within days. Files are not romance. They are lives arriving alive. Serviceability, the word that makes airplanes sound like kitchen appliances, is the quiet star of the pipeline. Keeping machines flyable depends on ground crews who are treated as craftsmen, not as afterthoughts. Training for them is not a pamphlet. It is time with tools and mentors and engines that have been allowed to misbehave in controlled settings so that mechanics can practice persuading metal to be good. The schedule that protects the line also protects rest cycles. A tired wrench hand is a saboteur without intent. So the people pipeline includes sleep. It includes cafeterias that do not insult. It includes medical staff who know that a back can ruin a mission. This is not sentiment, it is arithmetic. A well-rested crew chief increases sortie rate. Sortie rate wins wars fought by replacement. Leadership is taught too, not by lectures on greatness but by drills that make decision-making a reflex at the right altitude. Aircraft commanders learn to be boring, an underrated virtue, because boring leaders do not surprise their crews with improvisations born of ego. Boring leaders hit altitudes, headings, times over target. Boring leaders listen to their navigator when the math contradicts the map. Boring leaders ask their flight engineer a question before the engine tells the truth the hard way. Inside this boringness, courage finds room. When the formation is perforated and the sky glows with trace, a crew will follow a boring leader through fear the way a child follows a familiar hand through a crowd. The pipeline learns from the front. Feedback is the bloodstream. A squadron reports that a particular gyro drifts after so many hours. Training syllabi adjust to teach error budgets and cross-checks. A theatre notices that green crews tend to overbank under fire. Trainers write a script into the regimen where tracers rise, and the student practices keeping the yoke gentle while the world demands drama. Mistakes are harvested the way a farm harvests hay. Cut, dried, baled, stored, fed back when needed. The cycle closes only when the next class's hands behave differently because the previous class bled. In this way, the system achieves something that looks like compassion seen from the outside and feels like duty from the inside. Match rates across the network become the metric that matters. If factories accelerate but training lags, the war fills with empty seats and full statistics. If training accelerates but supply falters, eagerness sits on benches. The achievement is the overlap, the place where delivered airframes meet, delivered crews and the maintenance backshops have spares in bins, and the mess tent is not a joke, and the weather officer is listened to because his math chaperones everybody's courage. A mature pipeline is not noisy, it hums. It tolerates individuality without becoming hostage to genius. It produces thousands of men and women who can, on demand, make the same good choice. In the end, the people pipeline offers the same verdict as the line: adequacy multiplied is superior to brilliance rationed. The enemy cultivated aces. The system cultivated habits. Habits are distributable courage. When a crew walks toward a bomber that smells like cold fuel and canvas and guns oiled yesterday, they are not walking into an adventure, they are walking into an agreement. The agreement was written months ago, across classrooms and hangars and night flights and simulators that make men queasy and proud. It states that the machine will behave like the book, that the crew will behave like the syllabus, that the formation will behave like the doctrine, that the mission will behave like the plan until the enemy votes, and then the plan will bend but not break because the people can think inside a standard. Somewhere, in that quiet overlapping of disciplines, the hour achieved on the line becomes the hour survived in the sky. Intelligence fails in two ways, by not knowing and by knowing the wrong thing too precisely. The Luftwaffe suffered both. It stared west across a weather system and a language and a continent and tried to read production through keyholes, signals too sparse, photographs too late, and human reports shaped by fear, pride, or boredom. It counted airplanes because airplanes could be counted by young men with cameras and older men with rulers. But the enemy was not a number of airplanes. The enemy was a rate. No reconnaissance camera ever caught cadence on film. The German system entered the war with a bias toward the tactical beautiful. Sharp men making sharp decisions in cockpits, regiments that maneuvered like ballet, logistics that obeyed operational art in weeks and days rather than in months and years. When you wage short wars, you can afford to be clever. When the war lengthens, clever becomes a parlor trick performed in a room whose walls are moving inward. A tactical air force fighting strategic production is like a duelist arguing with the tide. The Luftwaffe's best minds knew this dimly and too late. Reports from the Western Front read like diaries from a storm. We shot many, there were more. The historian can almost hear the pencil pause over the paper as the writer realizes that more is not a tactic's fault or a pilot's failure, but a prophecy fulfilled elsewhere. Signals intelligence did not rescue them. American factories did not announce target time over the air. What could be intercepted? The chatter of logistics, the chatter of training commands, the chatter of politicians arrived in fragments. Fragments nature taught in childhood not to trust. Meanwhile, German fuel shortages created a funhouse mirror in which everything looked smaller than it was. When you cannot fly as much as you wish, you begin to believe the enemy cannot either. When your training syllabus shortens under pressure, you assume the enemy's will too. When your maintenance backshops cannibalize aircraft to feed others, you draft narratives in which the enemy must be cannibalizing as well, because fairness is a narcotic when your bones hurt. The Germans did not merely lack data, they were poisoned by sympathy for their own predicament. A further cruelty: dispersion. American production did not reside in one citadel to be photographed and bombed and counted. It lived in a constellation of plants, subcontractors, rail yards, and ports that looked, from altitude, like America being America. The banality was camouflage. A small-town machine shop, a rivet plant attached to a place that once made washing machines, a rail spur lengthened by a union crew who did not know they were saving a mission in October. What camera tells their tale? A diligent analyst could map a portion of this web and feel brilliant for a week. Then a routing change, a supplier swap, a storm, a labor agreement, a new jig, and the map would ask to be burned. The Germans needed a theory of the enemy's economy. They settled for photographs. They also needed to read the psychology of their opponent, and failed because rival myths blocked the view. German planners admired the American machine and dismissed the American mind, thinking it soft, distracted, greedy for comfort. They were half right. The American mind did love comfort. So the American machine learned to produce comfort for itself, canteens that did not humiliate, shift schedules that made family life just survivable, foremen who learned that a kind word saved a sick day. The Luftwaffe read creature comforts as weakness and never recognized them as armor against attrition. A population invited to endure with a promise that endurance will be made tolerable can outlast an ideology that demands sacrifice without offering a sandwich. Operationally, the miscount expressed itself in plans that waited for escorts to leave. If the bombers were finite and precious, then surely the guardians that ringed them were a temporary phenomenon dictated by politics and pride. Drop tanks would empty, Mustangs would turn back, the stream would thin and become meat. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. The mistake here was not arithmetic about range. It was a failure to see that the same logic that built bombers by the hour was building fighters by the hour, and that logistics had become a long arm stretching deep into enemy skies with a lunch pail, fuel caches, relay tactics, replacement pools, field maintenance practices that turned a field into a factory under weathered canvas. These were invisible to a mind trained to look for the dramatic hinge. The hinge now was small and everywhere. Intelligence failed in one more way. It mistook the enemy's announcements for propaganda and its silences for shame. American public relations bragged and remains insufferable in the archives, but sometimes it told the truth slant. When planners in Berlin read claims about production miracles, they marked them down as theatre, because theatre had served their own regime so well in other venues. They did not ask the practical question: if even half of this is true, what doctrine survives? If even a conservative fraction of the cadence exists, which of our sacred tactics must be retired and which new profanities must we learn? By the time skeptical minds softened, the sky was full of proof, spelled out in contrails and tracer and aluminum that refused to stop arriving. There is a sympathetic reading available to us, if we are honest. Imagine a controller at Stade or Rain or Wunstorf with a map and a phone, and a responsibility that will not fit into his chest. Imagine him receiving reports that contradict each other in detail and agree in essence. They are coming, they are many. Imagine him sending young men into a sky that has decided to be a meat grinder today, because the wind is wrong and the sun is low and morale is wounded. It is indecent to sneer from history's balcony. The failure was not moral, it was doctrinal. He was taught to measure strength in aircraft available and pilots rested. The enemy measured strength in hours that would continue even if pilots fell and aircraft burned, because the line behind them did not care about today's weather. The enemy had learned to be tranquil about loss not because life was cheap, but because cadence was dear. In the end, the miscount is a mirror. The Luftwaffe looked into it and saw its own handsome face tactics. Élan, a genius for the immediate, and believed that the reflection was an enemy. But the enemy was elsewhere, humming in daylight and at midnight, counting seconds and tolerances and changes of shift. The last sentence of the intelligence failure was written not in a report, but in a silence. One morning, men waited at runways that had nothing left to launch, fuel drums empty, spare parts spoken for by ghosts. And they listened. The Americans were late by a minute, perhaps two. Then the far sky bit its lip, and the horizon grew engines, and the men understood with a clarity that hurt. They had been counting the wrong thing, and the bill for that error was due in contrails and fire. Losses are logged, replacements slot in, sorties continue at an altitude of indifference that seems almost rude to the men who have just landed shaking. Commanders who once watched the weather as if it were a god begin to watch delivery schedules with the same reverence, because in a replacement war the sky is simply the medium through which logistics speaks. The first week this feels like blasphemy. The second week it feels like strategy. The third week it feels like mercy. A group loses 9 aircraft in 3 days and regains 11 in 5, and the table that frightened everyone on Wednesday looks different by Sunday afternoon. There is grief, there is repair, there is resentment at the indifference of numbers to names. Then there is the relief that follows a pallet of spares and a train of engines and a draft of crews who can read the same checklists in the same cadence as the men they replace. At first, the replacements speak too softly and stand with their hands too neatly at their sides. By the second briefing, they laugh at the same gallows jokes, which is to say they have learned how to fit their fear into doctrine. Tactics try to hold the initiative by inventing edges. They hunt particular weather, particular altitudes, clever cuts at the stream, and sometimes they bite hard. But replacement fills the cut with time until the wound remembers its shape. The killboard cannot bully the railroad schedule. Commanders discover that mass is not merely massed aircraft. Mass is the ability to be ordinary tomorrow after an extraordinary day. It is the willingness to accept that some brilliance will be lost to doctrine so that most crews can survive long enough to become boring. Big week makes the lesson legible. Losses rise, pressure rises, promises are made, promises are kept, and within 2 pay cycles the rhythm settles into something like contempt for suspense. Squadrons that would have been spent in another war are, here, replenished before despair hardens. An airfield that looks like ruin at dusk looks like patience at dawn. The runway tells the truth. Black scuffs where tires wrote the names of the saved. Divots where a wheel kissed concrete wrong and was forgiven by engineering. Stains of fuel that smell like a second chance. Replacement beats tactics because fear cannot outlast a habit when the habit keeps arriving with metal and men. Intelligence summaries change temperament. They become weather reports, serviceability percentages, sortie counts, depot throughput, average time to change a turret, mean time. Between failures inching upward as maintenance practice becomes doctrine instead of improvisation. The language grows boring on purpose. Boredom is peace dressed in work clothes. Crews begin to measure missions not by their drama, but by their compliance with the plan. Any day that obeys the plan is a victory against panic. A new psychology enters command. The caution that once protected fragile assets yields to confidence that assets will be remade. Risk becomes rational because replacement tames the consequences of bad luck. Leaders do not grow cruel. They grow practical. They ask the one question the enemy cannot answer with tactics alone. Can you still do this on Friday? And the Friday after? When the answer is yes often enough, the theatre changes shape. The enemy, outnumbered by next week, must hoard. Hoarding is a tactic against famine. It is not a strategy against a clock. Walk the ramp after a hard day and watch philosophy turn wrenches. One ship taxis in with a wing that wears flak like freckles. Another coughs on rollout and clears its throat in the run-up bay, while a chief listens with a mechanic's second sight. A third lands as if the morning were a rehearsal, and the afternoon an encore. Beneath them, the parts appear as if by spell, though the spell is merely competence dispersed over thousands of miles. Checklists grow wings of their own, flying station to station, making amateurs into practitioners, and practitioners into teachers. A bad bearing is confessed at inspection, and replaced before it can write its confession in fire. By midnight, the hangar smells of solvent and ordinary salvation. Replacement also rescues imagination. Because commanders trust the rhythm, they can risk the exceptional, a feint at dusk, a double strike at rail yards, a raid flown low because the weather insults the tables. The line behind them will forgive their audacity by rebuilding its costs. The enemy learns to fear absence as much as presence, the absence of depletion, the absence of pause. They shoot down many and hear engines tomorrow with the same indifference that humiliated them today. Replacement is the opposite of flair. It is humility institutionalized until it humbles the brilliant. It is the dull courage of doing the next necessary thing, and then the next, and discovering that the next is inexhaustible. By the time the enemy understands that replacement has turned the narrative feral, the story has stopped caring about heroes. Aces still kill and die, crews still vanish into cloud and rumor. Yet the formation that leaves tomorrow morning looks like the formation that left today, and sameness eats at men who believed war was a contest of style. Replacement does not argue. It arrives. It arrives again. It keeps arriving until the contest of style becomes the maintenance of denial, and denial cannot be flown. To watch a bomber rise is to watch geology and chemistry and governance become lift. Ore that once slept under distant hills becomes alumina. Alumina yields to electrolytic force and is reborn as ingot. Ingot rolls and stretches and hardens into sheet and extrusion that quietly accept the idea of sky. Downstream, refineries herd fractions out of crude until one of them answers to 100 over 130 and behaves with a temper that engines respect. None of this is theatrical. It is clerical. The web is a bureaucracy that learned grace. Power flows where schedules say it should. Electricity becomes an officer of the war. Kilowatt hours are translated into square footage of wing. Pipelines draw quiet lines across counties that never thought about aviation. The pipe's heartbeat is the pump, and the pump's heartbeat is a diesel that also keeps trains truthful. Oceans are not barriers, they are conveyor belts, and convoys are the rollers that carry crates and barrels and rumors of velocity. Railroads move like arteries nobody notices until a blockage hurts. At yards, men with pencils and flags conduct symphonies of freight without ever seeing the music from above. The supply web's genius is redundant modesty. If a forge fails, a sister shop takes the order, and a dispatcher reassigns a consist with the shrug of a professional. Stockpiles are not hoards. They are time made visible. Fuel depots refill according to a math that forgives winter's meanness. Timber mills that once argued with nails now marry wood to airframes that accept the marriage. Rubber plantations whisper to tire factories. Chemists sweet-talk winter until icers become a habit rather than a miracle. Across the web, little contracts become a constitution. At the end of the chain stand quartermasters and expediters whose faces have forgotten theatre. Their religion is the promise kept. They are paid in on-time arrivals, and the relief in a pilot's shoulders when he sees drums and pallets stacked like sentences that already know their verbs. They lie to bullies, flatter bureaucrats, and in general behave like the bloodstream the nation deserves. The enemy's bombs do find yards and depots, and for a day the map goes purple with embarrassment. The day after, sidings that used to be shy become bold. A warehouse with a boring name turns out to have been a second warehouse with a different boring name, and the river of stuff resumes its old habit of pretending to be inevitable. Webs teach humility because no node is sovereign. The plant that fabricates turrets knows its glory depends on a subcontractor's glass that does not ripple at altitude. The refinery knows its triumph counts for little if valve packing leaks in January. The air depot knows it is nothing without the patience of railmen who grease bearings, curse paperwork by name, and keep a timetable that ignores speeches. From the air, this looks like national power. From the ground, it looks like a million small competencies returning phone calls on time. That is how a republic does strategy. It launders it through manners. When the web is mature, commanders plan like dockmasters. They ask not whether an operation is glorious, but whether the trains will agree with the weather. They are not ashamed of such questions. Glory that disobeys the schedule is treason to the mission. Because the web keeps its promises, the combat calendar can be written in ink. Ink is a weapon. Factories then read the calendar as if it were a purchase order from the future and make good on it today. The Germans try to hurt continuity and sometimes succeed, but every victory they score against the web arrives late to its own funeral. Destroy a bridge, and pontoneers throw a road across water before the echo fades. Torch a warehouse and dispersed stores. Feed from edges inward until the gap closes. The American genius here is not flawless defense, it is shameless repair. Pride is the most dangerous shortage in war. This nation learns to love plywood and patches and ugly interim solutions that keep the hour rather than protect the photograph. Suppliers learn to gossip accurately. A rumor that a gasket batch runs brittle crosses 3 states by telephone, and a week later the bad lot is a ghost. Rail schedulers learn to see around corners. Truckers become diplomats. Port hands become mathematicians. Clerks become priests of paper who know that a missing form can delay a wing as surely as a missing spar. Everywhere the web teaches the same catechism. The right thing at the right time for the right station. When one node suffers vanity and tries to be exceptional, another node quietly absorbs the shock, and the web forgets the tantrum by Tuesday. The moral feature of the web is trust at scale. Workers who will never hear flack choose to keep promises to strangers, and in the keeping those strangers survive. The web is not simply machinery and law, it is a republic of courtesies extended along rails and pipes and roads. When courtesy hardens into habit, cadence emerges like a river that has found its bank. That is the web the enemy never quite saw, not because it was hidden but because it was boring. Only after defeat does boredom reveal itself as a style of power. From oar to wing, from crude to flame, from ledger to lift, the web turns nouns into verbs and verbs into arrivals. The airplane is the visible miracle. The web is the invisible one, and it performs on time. There is a kind of leaflet the sky drops that has no words. It is the procession itself. When a city hears engines at noon, and then again the next noon, and begins to suspect that tomorrow will bring the same noon, the mind changes without being asked. The enemy intended psychological operations to talk people into surrender. The schedule talked people into belief. For populations under the bombers, dread became a calendar. For the men flying and maintaining, confidence became a ritual. Rhythm revised the inner weather of everyone it touched. In Germany, rumour mills worked shifts. Civilians learned to measure the future by the density of contrails and the cadence of sirens. They intuited, with the ghastly wisdom of civilians, that this rhythm would be difficult to interrupt, because it was not a tantrum but a habit. Habits are immune to speeches. Meanwhile, in the American camps, the same rhythm offered a kindness, predictability in an unpredictable trade. Men fear randomness more than danger. A deadly job whose contour is known can be endured. A deadly job that feels accidental breeds mutiny in the soul. The schedule domesticated terror by declaring visiting hours. It gave despair an appointment and then kept overrunning it. Commanders could threaten precisely because they could deliver precisely. Announced campaigns were no longer bluff. They were drafts of work orders. An enemy leadership that had survived on theatre found itself eating theatre that tasted like cardboard. Across the lines, German planners harangued courage. American quartermasters padded fear with predictability. If you ever wondered whether the human spirit knows the difference between exhortation and competence, read the diaries. The pages that breathe easier are the pages that describe timetables. Individual psychology bent under the pressure and then learned to stand. New crews arrived, eyes bright, stomachs tight, and were absorbed by a system that dulled panic with protocol. Gear checks replaced talismans, checklists replaced bargaining with fate. Even superstition was standardized mascots sewn in the same place on jackets, rituals performed at the same step in the same hangar bay, because order is what frightened mammals invent when faced with randomness. The difference here is that the order belonged to reality as much as to comfort. Reality, in the form of deliveries that matched promises, closed the loop. When the loop closes, anxiety has fewer places to hide. On bad days, the rhythm cracked. A weather front laughed at an ops plan. A depot shipment slipped a day. A unit took a punch that knocked the name off its gate. The next morning, the whistle still blew. A hangar smelled like solvent and coffee. A schedule printed last week told men where to stand today. The psychology of production is not about cheer. It is about furniture. It gives the mind a table to sit at while fear passes. For the enemy, the propaganda of cadence cut another way. Soldiers and civilians sensed that the Americans had solved something adult. A machine that keeps its promises to its own becomes hard to hate, harder to defeat, and hardest of all to narrate away as decadence. The loudest voices kept repeating that the enemy was soft. The sky kept repeating that the enemy was punctual. Dissonance hollowed belief. When faith collapses in a system that demands everything, the collapse is not theatrical, it is granular, one resigned shrug at a time, until duty becomes a costume that no longer fits. The schedule did not just bomb buildings, it bombed certainty. On the Allied side, there was danger too. Sustainment can become tyranny if it forgets why it sustains. Schedules can grind individuality to paste. The miracle is that crews found room to be human inside the cadence. Jokes flourished, romances too, bad poetry especially, the human weeds that sprout in any crack the machine leaves. The machine left cracks on purpose. Rotations were not perfect, but they were credible. Rest was not lavish, but it was real. The ethic that made 2 bombers per hour possible also made a decent mess line, a hot breakfast, a mail run that arrived often enough to be believed. These small courtesies thickened morale into something chewable. Morale that can be chewed can be swallowed. It becomes energy instead of rhetoric. Propaganda, in this environment, became arithmetic. Show up on time, send the promised number, repeat. After enough repetitions, even cynics must choose between changing their minds or suffering whiplash. Some kept their cynicism and learned to be punctual about it. Most adapted. The schedule rearranged desire. Men began to want what the cadence wanted. The neat takeoff at the appointed minute, the clean join at the appointed altitude, the target crossed at the appointed second, the home field reappearing when the math said it would. The heart, tired of being lied to by chance, fell in love with clocks that told the truth. That is production's deepest psychological trick. It does not conquer by awe. It conquers by reliability until reliability feels like kindness, and kindness feels like strength. Again, this story does not end with a cheer. It ends with a verdict. The Americans did not win because they were better at the heroic minute. They won because they turned minutes into citizens, and citizens into minutes until the clock itself seemed to vote. The system insisted that adequacy repeated would defeat brilliance rationed, that sameness kindly enforced would beat genius offered as a treat, that boredom, given a schedule and a purpose, would hum like a turbine. The Luftwaffe fought like a duelist, and often beautifully. The Republic fought like a workshop, and often clumsily. Beauty loses to clumsy, when clumsy can afford to fall and stand again before lunch. This is not an argument against art. It is an argument for infrastructure as destiny during storms. The quiet people clerks who wrote requisitions clearly, machinists who loved gauge blocks, nurses who moved sleep toward the men who needed it most, switchmen who fostered punctuality like a household god. These were the strategists of replacement. They rarely spoke loudly, but their schedules did, and the schedules were obeyed. Democracy at war practiced a paradox that peace forgets. It standardized without humiliating. It demanded without demeaning. It absorbed difference not because it was sentimental, but because difference fed the rate. A line loves many hands so long as they keep time. A republic loves many souls so long as they can stand in line together without apology. The bomber hour was the handshake between these loves. It trusted strangers to keep promises to strangers and made that trust measurable. Measurement did not empty the enterprise of meaning. It gave meaning a schedule. To maintain such a schedule required a creed modest enough to survive success. Pride is a solvent that dissolves cadence. The creed therefore honored maintenance over spectacle, repair over reputation, the gauge over the speech. It asked leaders to prefer the boring question, "Are we still on time?" to the intoxicating one, "Are we original?" It asked citizens to believe that punctuality could be a form of courage. When the courage held, tempo did, and tempo converted hope into departures. The enemy, brave and acute and starving, fought brilliantly in seconds. The Republic chose minutes and hours and weeks. History sided with the larger units. After victory, the temptation always arrives dressed like comfort. You can fire the night shift. You can let inspection grow lax. You can allow doctrine to become a pet instead of a tool. The lesson here is maintenance of the schedule as a civic act. After the sirens and the ribbons, the habit must be cared for, or it will unwind into theatrics again. The genius of the bomber hour was not in polished aluminum or shouted commands. It lived in the unremarkable fidelity of strangers to strangers. Keep that fidelity and the next storm will find a nation already spinning up, quietly, politely, with coffee and checklists. If you stand years later on a museum floor beneath a bomber that smells faintly of oil that will never again be warm, you can still hear the clock in its bones. Not the pilot's watch, the factory's clock. It ticks in rivet rows, in inspection, stamps, in placards that tell you how to open a hatch without angering physics. Listen hard, and you will hear another sound layered over it. Trains, forges, typewriters, cafeteria spoons, lullabies sung too late by mothers who will wake at 5 to pull a lever at 6, so a wing can meet a spar at 7. 2 per hour was the number. The meaning was simpler and harder. Make tomorrow today, then do it again. What the Germans never knew was not only how many, but how unafraid a people can become of repetition when repetition is honest work. The last artifact of that fact is not the airplane or the parade. It is the schedule written in a hand that refuses drama. It is the ordinary signature that closes a ledger and opens a runway. It is the quiet that follows a shift whistle, when a free people briefly breathe like a machine and find, to their surprise, that the feeling is not dehumanizing but humane. For the machine they imitate for a moment is not a tyrant. It is their own agreement made visible. That agreement is democratic, because anyone may sign. The assembly line is not a marching order from above. It is a consent to keep time together. Consent scales. So does mercy, when habit makes it cheap to give. War taught this, and then, as wars do, tried to make the lesson sound old. It is not old. It is a modern courage hiding in plain sight. The courage to be reliable. The factories that learned that courage wrote it into metal and sent it east. Those who met the metal learned to hear the courage inside it. In the end, the story is not about engines or altitudes. It is about a calendar that did not blink when men did. It is about a promise kept every hour until the hour itself felt inevitable. That is all victory ever is, stripped of embroidery. Inevitability earned, one ordinary minute at a time.